So I consider myself one of the luckiest people on earth because I'm doing exactly what I want to do, and that is archaeology. So to start talking about, I'm going to tell you a story, and it's a long story, so I hope you all didn't eat too much and fall asleep on me. But I'm gonna start it at the beginning of time from the Navajo perspective. In the Navajo perspective, there was darkness. There was black. And there is a main deity by the name of Black God. And he takes two flint stones and he smacks them together and he bangs them together and it sparks. And when the spark happens, the universe explodes. So it's the Navajo version of the Big Bang Theory, essentially, through oral tradition. And so when the universe is created and the world is created, it's unpopulated by people. And so the Navajo in their tradition emerge from 4 different worlds to this, the 5th world. And during this time, they start out as mists and vapors and have no form. And they travel from world to world, and each world is flooded in succession until they reach this world. And at the time when it's populated, they're not quite yet Navajo people, but they're people. There are people who live here on this earth, and the earth is populated. And there is first man and first woman, but they're not human. They're deities. And they find a baby in New Mexico at Huerfano Peak. They hear a baby crying, and they go and they get her, and she goes from an infant to a full-grown woman in 4 days, and she's known as Changing Woman. And Changing Woman goes through all these different trials and tribulations. I could tell you the creation story in a couple of days, but I'm giving you a really brief snapshot of it. So Changing Woman creates the first humans, essentially. She takes clay and rolls it on the insides of her thighs, under her arms and under her breasts, and she forms the first humans. And she uses white shell to create their fingernails, jet for their hair, and coral for their genitals. And she asks the holy wind to come and blow through them and give them life. And so when the wind blows through the bodies of the humans and it escapes the bodies, it escapes through the hands, and that's why you have fingerprints from the bottoms of your feet. And that's why you have prints on the bottom of your feet and the swirl of the back of your hair. So the wind blows in and creates the first humans and creates the first Navajos. And the people go across and live on the landscape, but the landscape is a dangerous place. And so Changing Woman gives birth to twins. And they become known as the hero twins. And one of them is called Born for Water and represents the gentlest side of nature, and the other is Monster Slayer, and who represents the harsher side of nature. And they go through trials and tribulations, and they essentially slaughter the monsters who live on the earth. And as you travel the Navajo reservation, you can see the remnants of these monsters that were there. They're part of the landscape. They're part of the cultural landscape that make up the Aboriginal claimed land of the Navajo people. If you're traveling between Gallup, New Mexico, and Albuquerque in the Grants area, you'll see a giant lava flow, and that's actually the blood of one of the main monsters. When they kill him, they cut off his head. And they cut off his head and they throw it, and that becomes Cabazon Peak in New Mexico. And so there's all of these natural formations are all tied into the cultural landscape that you'll see on the Navajo reservation. So as time progresses and people start to live across the landscape, they adjust to their landscape out there. They see themselves as the people. When you talk to a Navajo, the traditional name is Dene, and it means the people. It means we are the people. And so they live in this environment that was created for them. And there are 4 monsters that were left alive that the hero twins never killed. And the 4 of them were hunger, because without hunger, they wouldn't hunt the animals, and the animals would overpopulate the world. And so they were given hunger. They were given poverty. So you would go and provide for yourself. You would take care of your family, so you were given poverty, so you could rise out of that poverty. They were given old age, so you could die and make room for those that are going to come next. let's see, what was the fourth one? I don't recall what the fourth one was. It was hunger, it was poverty, old age. Help me out here. Do you know the fourth one?
Something related to work, maybe?
No, it was, I don't remember the fourth monster. But
It'll come.
it'll come to me. But the fifth monster, there are different versions of the creation story. And some say the fifth monster was lice that was left. And lice was left so people would have to talk to each other so you could pick it out of your hair. And so you'd have to communicate. That was the fifth monster that some say was left alive. And so when you travel the reservation, you'll hear these stories from the elders and some of the younger folks. This is part of their history. This is ingrained in their culture. Every day when they go out and they start their day, the traditional Navajos will start their day in the morning by saying a prayer to the sunrise and offering corn pollen. And that ensures that their day will start on a good note. And they go out and they begin their day. And prehistorically, the same thing was happening, is that folks would go out every morning as the sunrise. They would look to the sunrise because every day the sun would come up. And without that sunrise rising up in the east, you can't start your day. So they would start their day, and their day would continue until the sun set. And then they would go back to their homes. And some of the most spectacular ruins are in Monument Valley and are on this expedition, and you'll see photographs sliding through. A lot of these are cliff dwellings, and the reason that these people are living up in the cliff dwellings is very interesting because in the area, in this area, it's known as Segi Canyon. So there are a lot of canyons, and it's canyonlands and bottomlands. But when it rains, they tend to flood. And the photographs you'll see deep cut arroyos. But at one time, it was all level land, and if you got a good rain, the area would flood, so you live on higher ground. And also, when you're living in those cliff dwellings, the heat from the rocks rises, and it keeps you warm. It provides heat as it rises up. And so it was a good environmentally place to live. It was a good place to be. And over time, there are different stories as to why the Anasazi disappeared. Some say that they left. Some say that they became the Pueblos that live now in New Mexico and in Arizona. But the Navajo believe that they were their ancestors, that they never really left anywhere. They didn't go anywhere. They just changed to their environment. It was a change in their culture. It was a change in the way that they lived that they needed to do because their environment was changing. And the change in the environment was a drought that happened around in the late 1100s. There was a 70-year drought. And a drought essentially is, as you'll know here in California, you get rain sometimes you don't. Sometimes you get these massive rainstorms that come through. And when the massive rainstorms were hitting, it started to undercut the arroyos. And so as the arroyos undercut, the farmland stayed here, the water table dropped. They left the cliff dwellings and scattered across the landscape. And as they scattered across the landscape, they changed. Now there are several stories as to why they changed from living in cliff dwellings. And I want to talk a little bit about the dwellings themselves. When you look at these cliff dwellings, most of them were inhabited by people, but they also served a dual purpose. A lot of the rooms were actually built and then filled with rubble. A lot of them don't have rooms or access to the outside. They're just empty shells. They're just rooms. And so the belief is that they were used as amplifiers. And so you could move sound that way. And when you're back in the canyons, even today, you can hear things from far off in the distance. You can hear people talking. You can hear cars on the highway. You could be 5 miles away, but you'll hear a car on the highway. It's so quiet. And that's one of the things that Elizabeth and I talked about years and years ago, was about how that sound carries. Because we carry sound with us everywhere we go now. We carry sound in our cell phones. We carry sound with our iPads and our iPods and our cars. We turn on the radios. We block out the world. We listen to music. We listen to the news. We listen to NPR. It's just always noise around us. When we step outside, there's noise around us. And at one point in time, you start to block out all that noise around you. And you only hear what you want to hear because you come accustomed to being able to filter out all that background noise. And one of the early stories that I talked to Elizabeth about was when I was a kid, I used to travel from Utah
from northern Utah down to Tucson where my grandparents lived. And we would do these long car trips in the 60s. And once you got outside of the city limits, your radio stopped working. There was no noise, it was quiet. And so my dad would get off of work and we would leave on a Friday afternoon after work, and we would drive. He would drive as far as he could, drive for 5 or 6 hours, and then he'd pull off the side of the road to sleep for a few hours before he started driving again. And at night, I was a little kid. I must have been about 8 or 9 years old. I would hear voices. I would hear people talking. And I would tell him, Dad, I can hear people talking. There's somebody outside. And he'd say, no, they're miles away. Sound carries at night. And he was right. Because I wasn't accustomed, I didn't have a cell phone when I was 6 years old. I didn't have a radio that could play constantly in my head. But I could hear things from a distance late at night. And so you have to put yourself back in time, go back about 500 years, and you're living in this canyon and it's dark. And the only light you have is the stars and the moon. And you're having a traditional ceremony, and you have people drumming, and you have people chanting, and they're singing, and that sound is amplified from these ruins, and it's pushing out down into the canyon walls, and it's rolling and going on to the next village that's a mile or two away, and then they start the drumming and the chanting, and it just goes on, and you have this whole succession of villages, village after village after village, picking up the sound as it rolls across the landscape and moving it through the night. And the sound itself is the prayer to the deities. You're asking for guidance. You're asking for rain, for good crops, for protection against, enemies that are coming through. You're asking for health. Someone is falling ill. You're asking for them to be cured. But all of this is just vibrating through the night, and it's amplified, and it's just moving through, and you have the sound wave just pushing over you. That's the world that the Anasazi lived in, that these early people lived in. Was this world of sound that carried on forever. And then as the night ended and you went to sleep, and the next morning when you woke up, you could hear the people grinding corn. You could hear the mothers calling their children to be careful not to walk to the edge of the cliff and fall off. You could hear the men going, we're going hunting now. We're going to go and work our fields. You can hear all that noise. But it's not just localized. You can hear it from the Orndler farm fields. You can hear people arguing and laughing and joking, and all of this is going on and on and on. And this is the daily life. And that's the voice that we want to give to the people who live now in the canyon. There was outside of Flagstaff, there's an area called Sunset Crater. And it's a small volcano that erupted, I believe, around, I'm going to say 1080, 1100, somewhere in there. And according to the seismologists who've studied this, they said when this explosion happened, and this is in northern Arizona, that when this volcano happened, they say that the people in California heard the noise. That's how loud it was. That's how far noise would have carried in the prehistoric past. That you could hear that eruption from that far away. And and today we don't hear anything. We can't hear more than 20 feet away from us. But the silence itself that Elizabeth talked about when she showed the photographs at the Winter Rock Fair is part of that silence, because we've silenced the people who live out there. And so when the expedition came out in the 1930s, you have diaries from the young men who were part of this expedition talking about their experiences and how they came from the east and the south, and they traveled out here to a foreign land, essentially, almost through a third world country, to a group of people whose culture and language and lifestyle was completely different than anything they'd ever known. And they write about this. They write about this in their diaries and their letter homes back to their families. And so when you see the photographs, and they're photographs of people, but we don't know who they are. They don't have a voice. There's no one there. There's no one there to speak for them. And so, thank you. The voice itself is, who are these people? And what was their story? What oral traditions, what stories did they pass on to their children or to their grandchildren that no one has ever asked them about? I was at the Winter Rock Fair And I usually don't go to the fair, I have to admit, because I've lived in Winter Rock for 25 years and I've been to a lot of fairs. As a tribal employee, I was actually mandated as part of my job to go to the fair and man some of the booths, so when I don't have to go, I don't go. But I went to go see Elizabeth and to meet Maddie, who I've only emailed with, and met Jameson and everyone else. And I was talking to some of the folks there that were standing there looking at those photographs. And they were going, "That's my aunt." I didn't know that. I didn't know that that this picture existed of her. And it gave a voice to that photograph, to that woman in that photograph. One man told me that that's my mom and her sisters. Because I've never seen this photograph of my mom before. And so it gives voice not only to him, but to his mom and to his aunts in that photograph. And that's the voice that we want to give to them. We want to also give voice to the people in the expedition, to the young men. One of the ideas that we talked about a couple of years ago in Durango was to have someone read the diaries of these young men to give them voice, to tell their story, but also at the same time to give voice to the folks in the photograph. What stories are behind those? Because it was a clash of cultures in a sense. You had Navajo families that were living there in the 1930s, and this is at a time when the Dust Bowl was hitting in the Midwest. It's hitting Texas and Oklahoma, and the people are migrating from Oklahoma to California. They're moving across the Navajo reservation. There are stories of migrants coming from Oklahoma and Texas and driving across the Navajo reservation. They tell of people dying and the Navajos helping to bury them along the side of the road as they're moving to the west. And so you want to be able to give voice to people, to make that sound, to let people know that they had a culture, that they had the ability to speak, which they don't have anymore because they're not identified. If you look at publications of Native Americans or the history of Native Americans, you'll always see, here's Colonel so-and-so and someone named, Indian guy. On Navajo, Navajos are one of the most studied Indian people in the world. There are hundreds and hundreds of books about Navajos, and a lot of the traders who've lived on the reservation wrote their biographies. And so you'll get photographs of, here's Trader Bob and some Navajo. There's a photograph that came out of the expedition of Everett Russ. And most people who live in the Southwest or have any interest in the Southwest have heard of Everett Russ, the wandering vagabond, artist, poet. And there's a picture of Everett with his mule. He's climbing up one of the inclines, and it comes out in every book about Everett. Here's Everett Russ, with his mule walking up this incline, and then some Navajo guy. Who's the Navajo guy? It's like, who was that guy behind him? And that's the voice that we want to give, because part of that is that long-standing tradition of those ceremonies that I talked about that have been going on for 1,000 years in those canyons. The people singing the same songs and praying for the same thing, for rain, for prosperity, for health, for welfare, for my family, protect me, protection, keep me from bad things, don't let bad things happen to me. The same things that we go to church and we pray for every Sunday. Those are the same things that every traditional Navajo gets up every morning and says as he walks out the door. I pray for my health of my family, my animals, that I get to work on time, that I'm able to provide for my family. That's the voice that we want to give, because that's exactly what these people were doing. They were providing for their families. Because what happened in the 30s, and it happened all over the West, is that they started to kill off livestock. They killed off livestock in Texas. They killed off livestock in Oklahoma because there was no feed for them. So the federal government came in and started doing stock reduction. But on Navajo, there was no other life for the Navajo people. It was their sheep. There's a saying on Navajo that sheep is life. Because from sheep you get wool, and wool you could turn into rugs. And the rugs you could sell them at the trading post and trade it for food. So it was part of that cycle of bartering and creating. And then the sheep itself, it's butchered, and they eat every part of the sheep. I mean, from nose to tail, everything is eaten. And they use every part, nothing is wasted. And so for the Navajo to see their sheep destroyed and just slaughtered and left to rot, it was devastating to them. And then you have these guys show up, and these guys are willing to pay. They have dollars, and they're willing to hire these families to pay, to pack in, to help them pack in and stuff. But not only that, when you look at some of these photographs, some of these young men are sitting close to these families. The Navajos became the surrogate families. These were young men who had left their mom and their dad, their parent, their brothers and their sisters, and everyone that they knew in their world. They went to this place in the Four Corners, and they found another family. They found this Navajo family you look at some of the photographs, they're sitting close together, and I asked Elizabeth, I'm wondering if some of them, became a little closer than they're willing to admit, because they were young and they were out, in a strange place, as young men do. But it kind of makes you wonder, it's like, what was going on through their heads, what was going through their minds? But we have the diaries of many of the young men. What we don't have is the voice of the other people that you see in the photograph, what was going on. And as Elizabeth pointed out, some of these photographs, people were explaining to their kids, this is what we used to do when we were younger. This is how we lived. And this is in the 1930s. These are people who basically lived in the Hogans and still continue to live in Hogans with no running water, no electricity. It's their lifestyle. And they do this every day. My mother-in-law has about 70 sheep, and every morning she lets them out, and they go wander across the landscape. And either she follows them or her brother follows them, or every once in a while they talk me into it since I'm retired, and I go follow them. And we follow them across the landscape every day. They go out and they eat the grass and herd them, and then they bring them in every night, and they do this every day, 365 days a year. There's no break. You gotta let them out. Every summer, you got to shear the sheep. Every summer, they shear the sheep and they sell the wool. Sometimes she'll dye the wool herself and cart it and dye it. But most of the time, she just sells it. She's getting older. It's too much trouble, she says, to do it the old ways. So you look at some of these photographs, and that's what they're doing. Is that they're boiling the wool. They're getting it ready to make rugs. Put it together, and so it's the stuff that my kids don't know. My kids have never seen. My two girls have never seen. My grandsons have never seen this. They've never seen their grandmother shear. They've seen their grandmother shear the sheep, and they've helped, but they've never seen her prepare the wool, card the wool, boil the wool, dye the wool, and then weave it into a rug. They've never seen her do that. It's slowly fading away. And so these photographs actually show that time where this wasn't an option. This was a daily occurrence. This is the way you fed your family. This is the way you took care of yourself. And it was at a time, as I said, when they took that from them. They took away their sheep. And without sheep, there's no life. And that truly is the saying on Navajo, that sheep is life, because sheep was given to them by the gods. It was given to them so they could sustain themselves. And there's a traditional story about how sheep and horses and cattle came back to Navajo. The Navajo believed in the 1200s that they were enslaved by this guy that was called Blue Feather, and he lived at Chaco Canyon. And Chaco Canyon is this huge area, and in Mexico, it's a national monument in Mexico. These huge sites, these room blocks are hundreds of rooms big. And it's the same thing. A lot of them are just big empty rooms. They're inside the interior of the building, and they serve no purpose. They're just four walls and a roof and a ceiling. You can't live in them. You can't build a fire in them. What were they there for? There are rooms that were filled in on purpose. And so, again, the idea is that the sound would move through these ruins and move out. So in Chaco, you have this guy, Blue Feather. He's also known as the Gambler. And he rules everybody. He enslaves everybody by gambling with them. And he gambles with you as you come in to do trading. He'll say, okay, want to play a card game? And he would play cards made out of human skulls, the tops of human skulls. He had cards. And he would play card games with you. And he would lose, and he would win and lose. He'd go back and forth. And then at one point, he would bet everything that he has against you. And he would lose everything that he owned. He would lose to you. And then he'd say, just one more game, and I'll bet myself against you and everything that you have. And he would win. So you would become his slave. So he enslaved not only the Navajos, but he enslaved the Pueblo people there at Chaco. And he would send them out on expeditions to go hunt and collect other folks to come in and tend his animals and take care of him and bring the food in and everything. So the Navajos, in their traditional story, they say that they were the hunters at Chaco, and they would go across the landscape and they would go hunt. And one time when they're hunting, they're out by the Rainbow Bridge. They're up in the Four Corner region, back in the canyons. When they get up towards Rainbow Bridge, they run into a young man. And they've never seen this young man before. And they say, okay, we're going to take you back with us to Chaco. So they take him back to Chaco, and he meets the gambler, and he doesn't really want to gamble with the guy, so they take him back out to Rainbow Bridge, the Rainbow Bridge area, and they tell the young man, they say, go across and learn to gamble. And as they slide him across the rainbow, it slides across, and he lands on the other side, and he goes off and he learns to gamble. And when he returns, he's in his mid-20s, in his early 30s, and when he comes back, he gets on the rainbow. When he slides across the rainbow, it turns to stone, and it creates what's now Rainbow Bridge. And so when he comes back into Chaco, he knows how to gamble. And so he starts to gamble with the gambler in Chaco, and they go back and forth and back and forth. They go back and forth. And so finally, the gambler says, I'll bet my life against yours and all that you have. And they're playing games of chance, cards, their foot races and different things, and they're both cheating basically. The gambler's cheating, and this young man is cheating. He's having help from the various deities, and the animals are helping him. And so the young man wins, and he wins the soul of the gambler, essentially. And so he tells the gambler, he says, you have to leave Chaco and free all these people. So the gambler says, okay, not a problem. There's an area in Chaco Canyon, and it's right next to not Pueblo Bonito, but Casa Rinconada. It's a large kiva site in Canyon de Chelly, across from Pueblo Bonito. And there's an area, there's a rest stop there. There's a parking lot, and there's an outhouse there that the Park Service put. And just about 150 feet away, there's this little tiny artificial mound of dirt that's out there. And that dirt, the archaeologists believe, came from when they built Casa Rinconada, when they built this big subterranean room. They hauled all that dirt out there and they piled it out there. So the story goes, in the Navajo tradition, is that when the gambler is kicked out of Chaco, he stands on top of that pile of dirt. And he talks to everybody in Chaco Canyon at once. And you're going like, well, how can he do that? But if you pitch your voice from there, it actually echoes down Chaco Canyon. I know because I've done this. Not supposed to be up there, but look around real quick, no park rangers, and I run up there and scream and yell, and people look around like, who's yelling at me, But it pitches your voice. It actually works. And a couple of the people that I worked with over the years at Navajo actually did a study on that. They did a study on that story and how the sound would carry through Chaco. So when the gambler gets up there, he tells the people, he says, from this day forward, you won't be able to understand each other. So he changed the languages. So there are 14 tribes in New Mexico, and they all speak a different language. He says, you'll no longer be able to understand yourselves. He goes, but someday I'm going to come back. He says, and when I do, I'm going to take your language from you, and I'm going to take your land from you. And so they take the gambler, and before they shoot him across, they put him on a bow and arrow. Before they shoot him across, they get the horse, the cow, and the sheep, and they shrink it down, and they stick it in the gambler's pocket, and they shoot him across the ocean. In the early versions of the gambler story, when they shoot him across, he yells something, but they don't know what it is. No one could understand him. In the later versions, by the late 1800s, in the later versions when they're collected, and they collect some of the older versions. For some of the medicine men say, we don't know what he said, but some of the other medicine men say, he said, adios. He said goodbye in Spanish to him. And so many believe that when the Spanish came back in the 1400s, it was actually the gambler, because the Spanish brought with them horses, cows, and sheep. And they spoke in that language that he supposedly said when they went across. And so language and sound and voice is really important, and it's an important part of the culture. So at that point in Chaco, the people that were there, they couldn't speak to each other again. It was like a Tower of Babel, essentially, and so they didn't know what to do. And so the deities come down and they speak to the Navajo, and they say, from this day forward, remove your religion from under the ground and bring it to the surface. And that way you will always retain your land. If you listen to us, you will grow, you'll be a prosperous tribe, you will grow, you'll be a prosperous people, will always have land. And so that's when the Navajo become the Navajo that we know today, that live in the Hogans in the traditional stories, is that they no longer lived in pueblos, but they went across the landscape as they were directed. And the Navajo believed that they did exactly as they were told, and they benefited from it because they have the largest reservation in the United States. It's 16 million acres. When the Navajo Reservation was first created in 1868, it was very tiny. It was only a few 100,000 acres. But over the years, from 1868 to about 2 weeks ago, the Navajo Nation has grown. It has actually grown. Congress over the years has added land to the Navajo Nation. It kept growing and growing and growing. It started out really small, but it just got bigger. It's over 16 million acres. Navajo Nation has a very aggressive buyback program of land. So they're out there buying land, and they just keep growing the reservation. And they say because of that, because they listened to what they were told that the collapse of Chaco was to move their religion to the surface. So having that story, having that voice, having the ability to pass that knowledge on is important. And so as you see the photographs that were scanning across the screen, you see the ruins, you see the folks, you see the people. What we're trying to do in all of this is to give them that voice, is to say, here they are. This is who this was. This was somebody's grandmother. This was somebody's mother. We all have family albums. I have photographs of my grandparents from when they got married in the 20s, and of my parents. But a lot of the Navajo families didn't have access to photographs, and a lot of them were just there on the landscape. People were just taking pictures of them, and they would just disappear. They never got copies. They just walked. People took pictures and left. And so we want to be able to not only give the voice to the families in these photographs, but also relate the stories that come with it. Because sometimes a photograph will spark that memory. I look at photographs sometimes of myself when I was a kid, and I go, oh, I remember that. I remember when that picture was taken. And now I have a story to tell my children and my grandchildren. And that's what was happening at the Winter Rock Fair, is that sometimes you had grandma standing there, you had, a couple of the grandkids, and maybe, one of her children standing there, and then she would start talking to them about what was in that photograph, who was in that photograph, what they were doing. And so she's now relaying that story, that event, to 2 to 3 generations of people. And so that's what we're trying to do as part of this, as part of all of this. And I hope that tonight I've been able to intrigue you with the story. I hope I made sense. That's always important. But this is something that's very near and dear to me. It was a project that I talked to Elizabeth about, which had absolutely nothing to do with any of this. It was basically the Navajo Nation attempting to get back the collection that was collected off of Navajo Nation land. And talking to Elizabeth at UCLA and saying, there's stuff that we want back. And kind of starting that conversation. And then Elizabeth and I just kind of growing that friendship out of that, and meeting Corey, and over the years just kind of talking about it. And I have to say that Elizabeth kind of took the bull by the horns and kind of ran with it. And so I'm very, very honored to be here this evening, that I'm here to speak to all you folks. I don't know how long I've been talking for, probably about 2 or 3 hours. But I really, truly hope I made some sense to you all. But, for me, being able to tell you that this is how I see the world in a sense. And I have to tell you that I'm not Navajo. My wife is Navajo. I've lived on the reservation, as I said, for 25 years. I spent a lot of time listening to folks as they talked. I've had the opportunity to work with some of the best medicine men on the Navajo Nation, who taught me a lot. And one of the things that they taught me was to sit and to listen to folks when they were talking. And so in my tenure working, for the Navajo tribe, I met a lot of really good people. I met a lot of medicine men, and listened to them, and was able to ask them questions and stuff. And one of the things that they always said is that stories are passed on orally. They're passed on from generation to generation, and that each time the story is told by a medicine man to the next medicine man, to the next person that they're training, or medicine woman that they're training, that story is told. And it starts with the creation story. And they tell their version of the creation story. And there are several versions of the creation story. It changes from person to person. And they tell me the reason why. There are different stories. There are different creation stories. There are different ways of doing the ceremonies. There's a slight change, and each medicine man will do it just a little bit different than the next one. I said, because if one medicine man knew the perfect way to do it, he could rule the world. And so they don't do it. They change it just a tiny bit, and each one of them learned a tiny bit differently than the other. So one last story. I'm going to go back to Changing Woman. So Changing Woman, when she creates the hero twins, gives birth to the hero twins, after they kill all the monsters, they go to the sun. The sun is their father, so they go back to the sun, and they live on the sun. And Changing Woman, she decides that she needs to go and rest. The deities go to sleep in the wintertime. So the cliff dwellings that you see are actually the resting places of the deities in the winter. They're not abandoned. They're occupied by the deities. But Changing Woman doesn't hang out on the reservation in the winter. She's smart. She comes here to California. Her winter resting place is actually Catalina Island. So she comes to California and goes to Catalina, and she spends the winter there. And in the summer, she comes back from Catalina, travels back to the reservation, and hangs out on the reservation. So last week, we had a couple of days of light rain and early morning fog. And I was out with a couple of archaeologists that I was working with. And we're out at 7 in the morning, and there's this light fog across the landscape. And I'm talking to them, and I'm pointing it out to them. I said, "You see that light fog out there on the landscape?" I said, "That's Changing Woman." I said, "She's come to see, to make sure that her kids are doing well." I said, when you see fog out there, I said, that's her moving through. I said, she's coming to check on everybody and make sure everybody's doing fine. I said, and then she's making kind of her last rounds because it's going to get cold soon, and she's going to go back to California, hang out in the sunshine. And they were looking at me like, this guy's crazy, But those are the stories that I tell my grandchildren. Those are the stories that I tell my children, to pass that on. So when they see fog, they'll say, that's Changing Woman coming to check up on me to make sure I'm doing okay. And so with that, I want to thank you all for listening and not throwing rotten tomatoes, because I think Maddie was passing some out back there. And again, I do hope that I made sense to you all, and I was able to provide you with an intriguing night at the least. And I hope that you'll help us out, I guess. So again, thank you, and I am honored to be here to speak to you all.
Thank you.